Next I want to do another brief test, and this is to see how your memory works.
Welcome to the VO2 Lounge, Exercise for Overall Health and Longevity. Exercise for overall health and longevity, in my opinion, is something that has exploded during and after the global pandemic. It can take different forms for different people due to the different stages in life we all occupy. For some of us, we may have barely exercised since we were at school, and now in our 50s, we fear the upcoming physical decline and would like to get our ship in order. For others, like myself, we are not only in the early stages of our life, but also exercise and, more importantly, competitive sports play a huge role in our life, and planning when to stop training, as much as we do, is more the focus and how a life is going to look without 15 hours of training a week. Now, my bias in all of this, for a bit of background, around 2020, 2021, I discovered the Peter Attia Drive podcast, mainly through his first interview with Inigo San Millan about Tadej Pogačar before he was, well, I say it was about Tadej Pogačar. Tadej Pogačar was mentioned without physically mentioning him, referring to him as an up-and-coming star or potential star. The podcast itself was more centered around training in a zone 2 kind of capacity and the potential impacts that training has, how we would prescribe it for individuals, all the cardiovascular effects, the effects on the mitochondria, substrate utilization. It was very in-depth. It was very interesting. And it was quite amusing to reflect on that episode 2 years later, once Tadej Pogačar had done what he had done, and be like, oh, that's who he was on about. And I think he did reappear on the podcast and so on and so forth. But I digress. There was a small descent into the human lab trench, but its format of being, as much as I personally produce this podcast as a single producer and a one-person show, for whatever reason, for me, as much as Human himself, when he's interviewed on the podcast, I am really interested in. When he does his solo podcast, I'm less interested in all of it. So there was only a small descent into that. But as per my personality type, I was now fully drinking the magic longevity sauce, worrying about the quality of zone 2, spiking insulin with different meals, sleep optimization, supplementation, different dates, genes that could expose me to certain risk factors, body composition, from the human side of things, the sunlight in the morning to start the circadian rhythm, no coffee until I've been awake for 90 minutes or whatever the magic number is. But now I'm on the other end of all of this, and I've generally a more pragmatic approach, and I see there's being more stages to life than just focusing on all these key kind of tools they mention or mechanisms and so on and so forth, and see it more as in your 20s to early 30s, the focus is almost, for me at least, an unhealthy obsession with sport, where I'm working to get myself into an elite part of a given sport. But thanks to the sort of trip down longevity lane, for lack of a better word, I recognize that the importance of balance, and so make sure that I still incorporate strength training into my endurance training, where that is clearly the focus. However, at this point in my life, very easy to put muscle mass on, quite easy to preserve it. So having a sort of mini off-season almost bulk, for lack of a better words, where really I don't worry about where the weight is. I'm not seriously overeating, but I'm just focusing on regaining some muscle mass, dealing with some imbalances, and kind of progressing that way before the actual season comes on. And really, it's just kind of body weight stuff. It's just as much stimulus as I can give to the muscles without overloading them when I'm already fatigued due to a busy race season. Plus, a lot of these online presences have much more freedom to exercise at different times of the day and the ability to plan their life however they see fit. If you just think of Huberman when he gave an example of a day for him and it included 90-minute naps. Now, for most of us, we don't even have a 90-minute lunch break. So unless we're going to have a nap when we get home at 5, 6 p.m., at which point you're so close to your bedtime, you don't really want to introduce some kind of relief of sleep pressure that close to before going to bed. So, and kind of ignore those kind of things. And when they incorporate their workouts, there are things you can take away from it. Like, for example, going to the gym first thing in the morning clearly has upsides of if you go to a very busy gym, it tends to be less busy than if you go straight after work. So, for us ordinary sort of typical people, we just have to do our best. But at the end of the day, be happy, which I think is somewhat overlooked in the longevity blueprint. As much as the people will mention it to some extent, but I think that has to be the almost bottom line of like, you've checked these 10 boxes, but at the bottom there needs to be a bit of small print saying, are you still happy? Because if you're sacrificing too much or it's just unsustainable, then it's not going to work. So let's get into this kind of episode and start off with kind of longevity goals and what the aims are. I know I only gave 20 to 30, but let me just sort of go back a second. So, for example, if you're 20, say in your 30s, you're playing sport very competitively, it's quite intrusive into other aspects of life and generally is very fatiguing. When you get into your kind of late 30s, 40s, 50s, it transitions into what I would call the full-blown longevity phase. The 20s are almost like the precursor. Like if you're doing nothing, then following these longevity plans could be a thing to do. But if you're already, say, exercising 10 hours a week, then you don't really need to worry as such. Like if you're doing if you're doing a sport like say rugby, then you've probably got all bases covered to some extent. You're probably doing strength training, you're doing aerobic work, happy days. Just worry about more the damage you could potentially do to yourself, whether that's cognitive through concussions and so on and so forth, which kind of weighs into this, as you get into your late 30s, or post 30, consider, stepping back from sports like that with risk factors. And it's essentially a game of risks. Like at the point you're 40 or 50 or even like 60, for example, say you're a keen skier, maybe at that point you're like, you know what, I've skied for 30 years. At this point, the risk is pretty high. If I injure myself, how hard is it going to be to recover? How much muscle mass am I going to lose? So on and so forth. So it's just about gating your life into sections of like, okay, this is the point where I just go all out into sport, but I have a thought of, okay, if I'm only a strength athlete, then I need to think about doing some cardiovascular work. If I'm only a cardiovascular athlete, like an endurance athlete, maybe I need to do some strength work. Then as you get into your late 30s, kind of 40s, maybe you've got a family, that's where it's easier to dial back because naturally you have less time and you can start considering, other factors and other things and balancing things up a lot. But that's kind of where my bias is and current standpoint of all of this. But I will say this episode kind of based off a blueprint of a mixture of Attia sources, different kind of synthesized bits of information. I think it provides a good blueprint. I think it just needs to be taken with depending where you get the source of and depending whether it's a podcast episode and what mood I suppose he's in when he delivers it, you just have to titrate it a little bit and make it fit for yourself, because obviously what he does may not fit everyone and also may not be the be all and end all of what is necessary to achieve what you want to achieve. So, longevity goals. As I said, with that out of the way, let's get on to like exercise for longevity. Now, I think really if we consolidate Peter Attia's advice, as I've said, we get something that's pretty worthwhile and concise to some extent. With a side note that the only reason to follow this is it is necessarily, if you're now in your 50s, for example, you're not exercising, then this is a great blueprint. If you are in your 20s or 30s and you're playing a lot of sport, then just use this as like a way of finding where the gaps are. Don't switch out your twice a week football sessions with friends for a solitary zone 2 session twice a week because it's more optimal. You think that football session is both a social and a physical activity, so it adds more to your life for your fulfillment than just the aerobic stimulus, the cognition. It is so beneficial doing a kind of team sport like that. If you're already doing it, stick to it. Now, to prepare for a long, active life, it is essential to train as though you're planning to maintain your abilities for the long term. And that's where I think the sort of stopping at a certain age, if you're doing something incredibly heavily, is key, because that's where you go, right, okay, I'm transitioning to a point in my life where I don't need a VO2 max of like 75. I can have a VO2 max of like 65 and still get by very easily. Now, one way to do this is by identifying the 10 most important physical tasks you want to be able to perform throughout your life, and then structure your training around achieving and maintaining those abilities. A concept sometimes referred to as the centenarian decathlon by Peter Attia. Now, the idea just simply being you just pick 10 pretty mundane to you now, depending on your age listening to this. But if you're like south of 60 even, most these should all be pretty mundane tasks. And for example, he gives one such as hike 1.5 miles on hilly terrain. So if you go on a holiday with family and it involves going on a long day out, walking around town, sightseeing, or going out in nature, you can do it. Get up off the floor without assistance, using no more than one arm to support. I think the idea of that is just to make it a little bit more challenging, and to show coordination. But the idea, I think, being basically you can get down onto the ground, play with a child, potentially pick up the child, something you would want to do as a grandparent. Again, he lists pick up a young child from the floor, carry 2 5-pound bags of groceries for 5 blocks, for example. So you don't necessarily, it's a good way of getting a little bit of exercise and stimulus there. You've got loads of time in retirement, so you can stop getting food delivered to your house and walk down to shops, pick up something that you particularly want. Lift a 20-pound suitcase into an overhead plane compartment. That's something I would have listed, because it just sort of summarizes the ability to, in reality, one, get on and off a plane pretty easily, but also it summarizes the fact that you can then also put stuff away at home. Maybe you need to put something moderately heavy, like a bag that's got something in it, on a shelf that's like above head height. All very useful tasks. Now, balancing on one leg for 30 seconds with eyes open, and a bonus he lists is for 15 seconds with your eyes closed. Now, have a strength and stamina for physical intimacy is described as basically being able to have sex later in life. Climb 4 flights of stairs within 3 minutes. Open a jar. Perform 30 consecutive jump rope skips. And this list is personal and should reflect your own goals and general priorities. But for instance, you might prioritize playing tennis over hiking, for example. That could be your thing. You want to be able to play tennis well into your 70s, or play golf without any discomfort. So be able to be out all day walking, essentially pull your clubs or keep them over your shoulder, for example, for an entire session. Essentially, it is just giving you this, I think, is most, if you're someone who already goes to the gym like 2 times a week, runs 3 times a week, then this is less important to some extent. It's more for the person who's sat there going, man, I didn't do anything. Why would I waste my time going to the gym or running? Because they look at it as a now, which is, human beings in general are very good at looking after themselves in the present rather than the future. It's part of how we survived. But really, what it does for that person and goes, oh, opening a jar, pretty convenient, but picking up a child, it would mean a lot to me. Being able to travel would mean a lot. And it gives someone something they're actually working to when necessarily the activity isn't as stimulating to them as an individual who's a lifelong, let's say, athlete. Like they've exercised their whole life. It's part of their identity. So with that, we can, from this, which will be a shock to some people, especially people like myself, who a training plan is never a 7-day-a-week affair. Whereas his plan, like his routine for longevity, is a 7-day-a-week plan. But I'll explain why. We'll go through it now. Hey, if you've made it this far into the episode, you've probably liked what you've heard so far. So why not follow the pod, assuming it's safe to do so at this very moment? Don't know where you are. Maybe in the car. Don't text and drive and all that. If you really like what you hear, why not share this with a friend and see what they think and see if they want to follow the show? But also, to start the conversation going, I've noticed that both Apple Music and Spotify now have a comment section. This podcast is not a video podcast, so we don't get comments through YouTube. So why not leave a comment of what you think so far of this episode and start the conversation today? Let's get on with the episode. What you'll notice is, okay, so Monday is 10 minutes of stability, then 60 minutes of lower body strength training. Tuesday, 10 minutes of stability, 60 minutes of zone 2 cardio at moderate intensity, or just zone 2 basically. Wednesday, 10 minutes of stability exercises, 60 minutes of upper body strength training. Thursday, again, another 10 minutes of stability, 60 minutes of zone 2 cardio. Friday, another 10 minutes of stability, 60 minutes of lower body strength training. Saturday, again, starts with stability, then 60 minutes of zone 2 cardio and 30 minutes of high intensity zone 5. For anyone who's really done an interval session, essentially what this means is you've got an hour and a half session, of which half an hour of it is comprised of intervals at high intensity. Then Sunday, again, stability, 60 minutes of zone 2 and 60 minutes of upper body strength training. Now, the reason this is like this, for some people you'd have to build up to it. But if you, especially as an endurance athlete, you would look at this and go, oh, actually, this makes sense why it's 7 days a week. Because the intensity/volume is low enough that really a 6-minute gym session, happy days, and then the next day having to do an hour on the bike or running, so just it could be pretty easy. Then the next day doing an hour in the gym again, then the next day doing an hour of cardio, and then the next day an hour in the gym, and then the next day, you're in the weekend having an hour and a half to do endurance work, pretty easy, and then again another 2 hours, which is an hour of riding or running, and then strength training. I'd say the only thing is that it's something you would want to build up to if you're a full couch potato at the moment. But what you do see from it, it highlights the importance of, or at least his value on stability work. Now, whether clearly here there is the thought process that little and often is key, which makes it, I suppose, easier to keep on top of. It's not something I focus on. Now, whether that's because of age and whether that's because of sports and work that I do still involves a level of coordination that means, like, I'm not on a static bike. One, I'm racing, so there's a lot of bunch skills, like riding at high speed around other people. There's a lot of sort of spatial awareness. There's a lot of balance on the bike. I do mountain biking. That also requires a lot of visual ability to be able to see a line, pick a line, a lot of cognitive work. And so whether that's enough, and then with work, there are sort of manual parts of my work that may require me to be in slightly awkward positions and lift things and do things and so on and so forth. Whether that's why, but really, this plan, compared to how I at least perceived what he did through episodes, is incredibly achievable. Because in reality, if you've got, like, say, for example, at your workplace, an hour lunch, you could fit in, for example, say running's your choice. You've got 2 days a week where you would run at work, for example, or you run to and from work. Maybe you've got a 40-minute walk to work, which could be a 30-minute run, or you've got a 30-minute ride to work, and then you ride to and from work, and say you do. I think the key for longevity for people and to stick to it is almost just to turn it into part of your daily routine, out of a decision. Like, you need to get to work, so why not turn it into this exercise? And then the gym, obviously you can't do that, so it has to be something. But then it means the 2 days that you go to the gym, or the 3 days, 2 or 3 days, they're the only times where you feel like it's taking time out. And then if one of these cardio days happens to be a sport like football, I'd say things where it's as much as at the highest level, things like tennis and squash, for example, require a lot of aerobic, a good aerobic engine, because you need to, endure through. But then to train that, you train that through actual aerobic tasks rather than just playing a lot of tennis, for example. Although there is a stimulus there. I'd say it's too broken up, and you'd want to stick to something that is a stimulus, an endurance stimulus from that perspective. So it could be a team sport like hockey, football, rugby. But if it's not that, and it's something like you play squash, then maybe, yes, you only do 60 minutes to 120 a week. But you make that decision yourself. You just go, that would be the healthy decision. You go, you know what, I haven't got space for a third zone 2 session, so yeah, I'm going to have my day of squash or day of tennis or whatever it is as a social activity. And then, I'll fit in my my zone 2 stuff elsewhere. So that's kind of the plan he puts forward. I think when you start, we'll go into a bit more. There's a bit more information on what actually all these look like, because obviously from here, this is high level, this is an overview, but let's go into what the actual breakdown is of all of these. But before that, the 4 pillars of fitness. To maintain the physical capabilities necessary for life's demand in general, training can focus on 4 essential pillars. Now, they are stability, strength, aerobic, and anaerobic. Now, stability, which is devote about 1 hour weekly to stability work, which is then split into 5 to 10 minute blocks before other workouts. I think it's a good way of it, putting it in. I think if you try clump it into 1 hour session, it's probably something a bit like a skill that's good to be like a repeated frequently. Strength, aim for 45 to 60 minute full body strength training sessions each week, targeting all major muscle groups. Now, I think full body over the course of a week, and then depending how many times you go in, like 3, you could follow the push pull, legs, for example. You could do full body each day. Just depends what works for you. If you're less consistent, sticking to full body's a better idea, because then if you do 3 sessions a week and you miss the leg day, for example, you've not done legs at all, whereas if you've got 3 sessions, they're all full body, then maybe you haven't hit the volume you wanted to hit, but you've hit all the muscle groups for the most part. Aerobic efficiency, 45 to 60 minute sessions of moderate intensity zone 2 cardio. Zone 2's really picked up in the last, again, sort of post-COVID era. There's a lot more focus on it in the sort of performance realm. It's just driven home, zone 2. I think it's overdone a little bit to some extent, because people now worry that, are they in zone 2? Is this zone 2 too hard? So on and so forth. I think If it gamifies it and makes it more entertaining, really focus on that zone. But for the most part, I think really it's just making sure you're not overdoing it. And you should know if it's too easy, but also just not pushing too hard. And then anaerobic performance, 30-minute session per week of high intensity VO2 work. That's probably the easiest one to tick off because it feels good, it's hard, and basically you just go full chat. You just go to the rivet, and the idea here is zone 2, really the duration is almost the stimulus. Yes, the intensity is partially the stimulus, but the duration is what is really driving the adaptions, whereas VO2 work, you're looking at the intensity, so you want this to be hard. If you only do 27 minutes, but it was really hard, versus like sort of hard, do 30 minutes, you're like, I could have done 40. You've kind of missed the idea of VO2 work here. You're really trying to up that maximal oxygen uptake. So you need to be at your maximal oxygen uptake. Now, I think the main takeaway is the approach develops strength, endurance, and stability to ensure you can tackle the physical challenges of life at any age, really. And this sort of framework, I think, defines when you're fully working towards this, it defines the point at which you've moved away from being quote unquote an athlete and moving towards this sort of longevity framework where you're no longer trying to achieve peak performance of a narrow sport. You're trying to achieve peak performance for human existence, essentially, in the current world we live in. So, like I said, we'll just go over the different areas in a bit more detail. So, it's training for stability. Starting with like a well-rounded workout schedule is a great foundation, but true progress requires more than following like just a plan. Fitness is not a short-term project. It's obviously a lifelong commitment, and I think because a lot of people, at least from my experience, get into this kind of industry and realm through the gym, where when you are new, you can lose weight, gain some muscle, and see a big change really quickly. Whereas, which leads to kind of this false idea of how quickly things improve and how, this is all pretty simple. Whereas if you do an endurance sport, yes, there are new gains, but they're hard won. So really, that is kind of, you're in a better spot. But most people come through it in a gym perspective. So the idea that this is the question I ask to myself often. I say often, usually when starting something new or doing something. I've done it with jobs. I've done it with entire occupations. I've done it with sports. Is, could I do this for 10 years? Like, in 10 years' time, will I still be doing this? And that usually, the idea of that like question to myself is, I've done it when I was doing indoor training a lot on the bike. I hate indoor training, but I was really smashing a platform called Trainer Road with the idea of getting my FTP up and all this stuff. And I asked myself, could I do this for 10 years? Wake up at 6 a.m., get on the trainer by 6:30, smash like 300 milligrams of caffeine, do this interval session, and then go to work. And I was like, no. And I was like, so for that very reason, there's no way I'm going to motivate myself to do this for a year. So I went to an approach that I could go, could I do this for 10 years? And maybe with like really packed race seasons, sometimes I go, probably not. But the idea with the really packed race season is that it isn't something I do for 10 years. But the general training around it, I'm like, yeah, I could easily do this level of intensity and volume and activities and so on and so forth for 10 years. No doubt about it. And that's when I know I've landed on a general methodology and way of going around things that is good for me. Now, the key is to approach each exercise with, focus and intention, treating every rep as opportunity to improve. Very woo, I know. But really, this mindset helps you build functional strength, enhance movement quality, and reduce risk of injury. Now, this is where stability kicks in. Now, the quality of the movement is key. Instead of rushing through exercises or push too hard, prioritize mastering safe, efficient movement patterns. The goal is to allow your body to work as it was designed to minimize injury and risk. Now, stability, strength is obviously crucial, but stability should be the foundation of your fitness journey, is argued by Attia. Now, spending time on stability training potentially up to 6 months before incorporating heavy weights can enhance control of your body. I think that potentially is for people who... It depends what age you're coming to this at, and it depends the level of just general human being you are physically at this point. It may not be needed for everyone, especially if you're starting younger. But how do you train stability? So they talk about this DNS, dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, which is a method that retains your body to perform foundational movements correctly, such as breathing, stabilizing the spine, and controlling extremities. It's akin to a software update for physical mechanics. You got toe yoga, which is simple exercises to enhance toe dexterity, can significantly improve balance and protect against falls as you age. There's a lot of that as well at the moment with the barefoot shoes and regaining that kind of toe dexterity, which, yes, as it says, can help into later life. It's the platform at which you move on, and yes, maybe when you're younger it's not an issue, and that's where things like this could potentially be something that you start working on later on. Not necessarily to say you have to wait until you're like 70, for example, but if you've already got a busy schedule of exercise programs, then potentially this is something you don't do. But with the 10 minutes a day thing, there's a tool they use. So in general, most of the stability exercise don't require any equipment, but one exception is the Mobo board, a tool designed to enhance foot strength and overall stability. It's described as being particularly helpful for athletes or those working on advanced balance training. But it's one of these balance boards. It's got a very specific design where it seems like the only toe that's supported is your big toe. And it's essentially a foot training device. Now, it's in the region of $100. It's not the cheapest item. There was another sort of two-piece board that he used to use that was like the heel and the the front of the foot were like on different moving planes. That meant there was a lot of activation of the foot to find balance. Again, the original product was quite an expensive product for, especially for non-Americans, to be honest. Spending £100 on a balance board seems pretty outrageous. But there appears to be various different equivalent knockoff items. Whether they're truly a knockoff or not, I don't know. But browse around, you can probably find something. They're probably a really useful thing to have basically in your bedroom. You wake up, you do 10 minutes worth of exercise. I'm intrigued to use one. Now that I've seen there are sort of budget equivalents, different things. I may give one a go, see what happens over 6 months, because I'm just curious to see whether I personally notice any difference in how my foot feels on the ground and so on and so forth. Never to dismiss anything. I just always think once a product's involved like that, I just get a bit like the barrier to entry becomes high enough that I'm not going to necessarily go through with it. But other than the toe yoga, you got core stability. Strengthening the core begins with obviously learning to create intra-abdominal pressure using the diaphragm and abdominal muscles. This is something you will become familiar if you've worn a belt in the gym for doing like deadlifts. Essentially, that is providing you with a wall to work with, and it helps you create that tunnel, that like trunk, by having something to actually press off. But this is something that you can essentially learn to do without kind of about, obviously on probably a lower magnitude, but that's the idea. Is it's this whole like cylindrical core bracing technique, rather than just like the front abdominals, and then balance and mobility exercises. Once a stable base is established, programs to include complex balance challenges and mobility enhancements. Cat-cows or scapular-controlled articular rotations. CARs, for example. Someone listening to this will know what that is, but they're essentially just more advanced movements, but trying to keep it within this kind of 10-minute window where you're just topping it up, wake up, do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that, and it looks to be, for the benefit of all of us, to be the way that training your stability seems to be quite easy in that respect. Now for strength training and longevity. Now after the age of 30, the actual process of sarcopenia or muscle loss begins, unfortunately. It probably begins earlier, but 30 seems to be the kind of inflection point, I suppose. Now, without consistent strength training, you could lose between 3 and 8% of your muscle mass per decade. Now, this decline not only slows your metabolism, but also diminishes your strength and ability to handle everyday tasks. Now, the slowing of metabolism, I think, depends on people. I always like to reiterate that because people have a different opinion on how they look at metabolism, but essentially muscle tissue is metabolically active. It requires energy. It is quite energy hungry. Your body has a habit of going, this muscle tissue, yes, it needs quite a lot of energy and it is not doing an awful lot. Like, let's say it's capable of 1,000 newtons of contractile force, and you only need 300, then it's just going to cut itself down until the point that it can't achieve 300, and then it's going to bump itself up a little bit, and then once it can just about do 300, nothing more, nothing less, it will sit there and it'll be like, I'm here to stay, but that 1,000 you used to be able to do, that ain't a thing anymore. Now, a way to look at all of this that is described is thinking as muscles as a reserve. Now, strength training can be viewed as a form of savings, essentially, for the future. Just as you save money to retire, you should aim to build a reserve of muscle to protect yourself from injury and maintain your ability to enjoy physical activities later in your life. Now, more muscle you build now, the better prepared you'll be for the demands of aging. These are the kind of things where people like myself, maybe you do a lot of activity already, have a habit of then going, oh man, I need to put on some more muscle. But you have to remember, most of the population don't. So if you already go to the gym twice a week, maybe just be concerned about how you're optimizing it, but don't worry about going out 5 times a week to build these reserves for. It's a bit like, if you're following in a financial state, if you're following the 50-30-20 rule, for example, of like 50% is your living expense, 30% you spend on frivolous nonsense, and 20% long-term savings. If you're that person already, and then you hear this like article saying people aren't saving enough for their futures, you don't need to go and save 30%. It's because most people are just burning what they have, and so then you as the individual who's already kind of like, man, I need to save a little bit more money, is then going to go out and think, I need to. But if you're already doing these things, don't worry, don't need to go to training more. If you're not doing any of these things, then think of it like a reserve. You need to start putting that 20% away. Now, the 4 key focus areas of strength training described as grip strength, concentric and eccentric loading, although you could put them into 2 categories, so it kind of is 5, but let's keep to the layout provided. Pulling movements, bloody hell, too much engineering, and hip hinging movements. So grip strength is an excellent indicator for overall physical robustness. You can enhance it with exercises such as weighted carries, dead hangs, pull-ups. For example, a practical benchmark is being able to carry your body weight half in each hand for at least 1 minute. To an element, mass doesn't really, I suppose it is a good thing because mass doesn't really scale that well in humans. You look at the difference in like as you get heavier, the totals from a powerlifting meet become a lesser multiple of body weight. But really, I suppose if you weigh 150 kilos and you have a high level of fat percentage, then probably you're going to struggle carrying that 150 kilos. Whereas if you're someone who's only slightly overweight, then you're more likely to be able to do it. But it still is a bit of a challenge. Like a 70 kilo person, 40 kilos, let's just say 40 kilos in each hand. It's a decent enough challenge, but it's a low enough bar that, that it's achievable. Now, concentric and eccentric loading. Now, building strength isn't just about lifting weight. It's also about controlling the movement. Eccentric strength, which involves lowering weight slowly, is essential for movements like walking downstairs or downhill. Exercises like rucking, hiking with backpack on, basically a weighted backpack, and slow step downs can improve this type of control. I have heard of people doing this basically in cities sometimes. They've got a very flat environment, don't like running, don't like cycling, and so their aerobic work is literally just putting a heavy backpack on and going for like a 1 hour walk or something. That adequate zone 2 right there. Perfectly adequate. Pulling movements. Pulling exercises are essential for functional strength, whether it's lifting groceries from the car or performing demanding tasks like climbing, including a variety of pulling motions in your routine, such as pull-ups, overhead pulling, and rows, horizontal pulling. As much as pull-ups are great, I think they are daunting for people at the beginning, so just doing lat pull-downs, for example, rows, those kind of things, all provide enough stimulus. People get caught up in the whole functional strength thing of like, I need to be doing these kettlebell throws and all that. The best functional strength you can really be doing is increasing your muscle mass. And I guess coordination, which will come from the balance stuff. But the coordination, really, the big stimulus would be some kind of team sport activities that requires limb independence and just general coordination. Just doing movements that maximize muscle growth and you controlling the eccentric and and exploding on the concentric movement. These are all functional. Yes, there's an element of certain sports. Say you're doing rugby and you've got a line out lift. Yes, maybe for the actual performing the movement, there is an element of, yes, do this kind of exact strategy in the gym to improve that. But for the most part, doing overhead press, building up the upper pectoral and the delts, getting them massive, really powerful, really muscular, is going to help the movement. So don't get too caught up in some of these outlets where they're saying, oh yeah, do all these wacky movements to gain functional strength. Just the general compound work movements and some isolation stuff as you get a bit deeper into things, all perfectly adequate. And then, you've also got hip hinge movements, exercises like deadlifts, kettlebell swings, and hip thrusts. I know I mentioned kettlebell swings and said, I personally aren't the massive fan because the swingy motion means that you can remove a lot of the muscular engagement to some extent. and something that is very almost absolute, like a deadlift where it hits the ground, it is on the ground, and now you need to pick it up off the ground. Hip thrusts, if you're doing them with a machine or a barbell, you get to the bottom of the lift, you're at the bottom, and now you have to lift it back to the top. You greatly improve muscles in the posterior chain, and single leg variations can be a safer starting point for those new to these movements, as they reduce the risk of spinal strain often associated with heavy axial loads. I'd say to some extent you could just don't ego lift so much, but that's the advice given. I'm not too sure on that line myself, but this next bit, blood flow restriction, that's where I think you then have to figure out whether you're an enthusiast, whether you just like listening to this content, or whether it really is right for you, because he caps a lot of these workouts with blood flow restriction. The method uses cuffs or bands to restrict blood flow from a target muscle group, enabling you to train it at lower intensities while still building muscle effectively. Basic blood flow restriction bands can work well, but advanced devices that adjust tension dynamically can optimize results. They are going to be expensive, and I think the real interest there from his point of view is this reducing the actual physical strain on joints and so forth, but still get the muscular development. I think for most people, there is so much left on the table through just general strength training that you don't really need to worry about stuff like this, these advanced lifting techniques. Look at this as you've got going to the gym, then you've got proper periodization / let's even say proper muscle balancing, let's say. So you are hitting all muscle groups for 10 sets, for example. Then you've got periodization of on weeks and deload weeks. Then you've got sort of further periodization where you're changing the movements you're doing. You're moving between strength and hypertrophy workouts. Then you've got supersets and drop sets where it's you are at the limit of how much stimulus you can cram into a single session. So now you need these lifts to stimulate more growth. And then I almost think you put blood flow restriction. Yeah, if you got all the finance in the world, sure, go do it. Go mad. But don't feel like to optimize your training, this is a necessary requirement, essentially. And then finally, my favorite bit, because at the moment I'm more of an endurance athlete than a strength athlete, cardio for longevity. So peak cardio respiratory fitness, often measured by VO2 max, maximum oxygen uptake, often referred to in a mil per kilogram per minute, which is where you hear a 50, or your Garmin says you got 42 VO2 max. Something I often end up explaining to people fairly frequently who go, I've got a VO2 max according to my Garmin at 45. And I'm like, yeah, nice. And they're like, what's yours? And I'm like, don't have a Garmin, so I don't know. And they're like, well, what is this number? Anyway, it's one of the most significant indicators of longevity. Improving your VO2 max can help you maintain functional fitness and feel biologically younger. However, after the age of 25, VO2 max begins to decline about 10% per decade, accelerating to as much as 15% per decade after the age of 50. I think there is some evidence that suggests you can potentially hold on to that peak VO2 maybe as late as 30, with the performances of some people in cycling, maybe even longer potentially. So look at it as a genetic potential peak at 25, but depending your training age versus your biological age. So training age just being say you got into running at 22, at 25, you've only been, your training age is 3 years. your biological age is 25, yeah, maybe if you'd had a training age of 10, you would have peaked here, maybe plateaued or maybe dropped off a small bit. Like you've diminished that curve rather than it being a point. It's like a very shallow curve coming down. But in general, yeah, begins to decline at that point, and then the level of exercise you do determines the rate at which you decline. Now, to counteract this, incorporating 1 to 2 30-minute VO2 training sessions per week can yield substantial benefits. I'll just go back slightly because I know I gave the opinion earlier that I thought maybe I didn't, but zone 2 was useless. I think what the best thing to come out of all this longevity stuff is the fact that people I know before who went to the gym and then did cardio stuff did like HIIT all the time. Maybe did it like 3-4 times a week, which isn't sustainable. And that's where that question comes back. Could I do this for 10 years? No. Burnout, feel horrendous. Haven't really developed any true aerobic engine. What it's done is shown people that really go all out once a week, and then the other like 2-3 days just kind of tick over. Just develop like the aerobic system. Teach your body to. You remember when, I think maybe, what was this, 2015? I can remember waking up in the morning, being fasted because I haven't eaten for like 10 hours because I've been in bed. Get up, go downstairs, have a coffee, black coffee, no sugar, bit of butter in there, get on the trainer and be like, man, I'm fat adapted. I'm getting fat adapted. I'm bringing lipids into my stomach. I'm doing aerobic work, and this is driving forward my fat adaptation. The reality is, if you simply just do zone 2 work, the way the body works, and as that aerobic engine starts coming up, you are going to prioritize fat anyway as a source of fuel because there's an abundance of it versus glycogen. So I am way more fat adapted arguably now than I ever was waking up in the morning and having butter in my coffee. It just seems so outrageous now. But anyway, we all make mistakes. But yeah, that's, I think, the best thing to come out of this. Now, VO2 max workouts, what are they? They're slightly less intense than sprints because a 10-second effort isn't a VO2 max effort. We're looking at a bit longer duration. The effective workout involves exercises that engage large muscle groups and quickly elevate your heart rate, such as rowing, running, cycling. You can use any of them. A proven method is interval training, of course, 4 minutes of maximum sustainable effort followed by 4 minutes of complete rest, repeated for 6 times. That's an example. Any cyclist, potentially any runner, would know a VO2 max workout looks like. You got lots of different options. You've got 30-30s where you go. They're quite easy. I say they're quite easy to pace. I guess you get used to it. They're a bit easier in the sense, I think a 4-minute VO2 max effort is the hardest thing to pace because 4 minutes flat out is it's really uncomfortable. It's really hard to figure out. It's really hard to get right and get the intensity right. Whether it's a 30-30, when you just go 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, you do that 10 times, you have 10 minutes off, you do it 10 times again, happy days. Usually the feedback loop is super quick, so you do the 30 seconds, you're like, oh, that was pretty hard. Then you do 30 seconds again at that intensity, that was also pretty hard. And if you get to 6 and you're flat on your ass, you're like, well, okay, let's cut this one short, come out of this, and we can learn. Next session, you go a little bit lower, and you can almost build into it as you go and figure it out. 40-20s, they're a bit more, I mean, you can have lactate, any of these, but they're more training repeatability. And then when you start going into 1 minute ons, 1 minute offs, I personally prefer to stop my VO2 sessions at 2 minutes for the most part from a long-term situation. 2 minutes is at the point where they become incredibly cognitively draining, incredibly taxing, and it's just something I wouldn't want to do when I need to do anything else that day. And then I personally leave 4-minute sessions for building into pre-big event or race season they're really, really taxing for me personally. I don't do them too often, but do whatever works for you. Essentially, upper end 4 minutes, but really 40 20s, 30 30s, 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 2 minute on, 2 minute off, that kind of stuff. That's where I kind of put the VO2 max session. Now, aerobic efficiency through zone 2 training. Now, of course, zone 2, we've mentioned it already. In addition to VO2 max sessions, low intensity cardio, often referred to as zone 2 training, plays a foundational role in overall fitness. Zone 2 training involves maintaining a steady effort level at around 65 to 75% of your maximum heart rate for an extended period of time. It's not only a cornerstone of fitness, but also a powerful tool for preventing chronic diseases by enhancing the efficiency and flexibility of your mitochondria, which decline with age. This is where the whole fat adapted thing kind of comes in. Is essentially you may hear substrate utilization, essentially where you're able to move between different fuel sources adequately. Now, improved mitochondrial function supports better metabolic health and may lower the risk of conditions such as heart disease, dementia, type 2 diabetes, and so on. Because really, you're preventing this whole insulin resistance. You are allowing your body to develop somewhat also stores for glycogen, just becoming a glycogen sink, essentially, outside of insulin. And also teaching your body throughout the day how to not be dependent necessarily on readily available sources of glucose. Zone 2 training, it could be anything really. Running, cycling, swimming, rowing, even hiking and walking, depending on your level of fitness. The key is to maintain an intensity that you can sustain comfortably for over 45 minutes. In the really early stages, and something I tried to convince members of my own family to do, is you invest. If you don't want to go to the gym, you invest in a treadmill, but walking on a 15% incline on a treadmill at 3.5 mile an hour, whatever's comfortable, can often be a really good zone 2 stimulus. And it's something that, look, if exercise is such a burden, you're trying to almost find hacks to do it, then I think that's the biggest one you've got really, is a static bike, a treadmill, something in the living room with the TV on, just moving at something that is a uncomfortable enough pace that you would rather be on the sofa, but it's comfortable enough that you're still enjoying the TV show and you're not thinking, when the hell am I going to get off this thing? For noticeable benefits, you're looking for like the 3-hour mark of zone 2 training per week, split into 45-minute sessions. Yeah, it doesn't have to be the full hour. It doesn't have to be an hour and a half. Once you start getting north of an hour and a half, in my opinion, you are becoming an endurance athlete and you're trying to achieve a goal of like a race time or a competition or something like that. If you're doing this just for the health perspective, then really 60 minutes is gonna elicit pretty good adaptions. Like, yes, my physical peak has been higher, so it's kind of tainted to some extent in the sense that the level of fitness I'm able to maintain just on like hour sessions is pretty high. But the fitness I've had in the past when I was on the way up just from hour sessions was pretty high. So clearly it is enough, and it's a very comfortable amount. It's not a lot of time, especially things like running where you just throw on shoes and go for it. An hour session is definitely a very good place to start, and then combining VO2 max intervals with consistent zone 2 training creates a good balance. This is where things get cloudier. Like if you're listening to some of these like the Attia Drive and stuff like that, talk about zone 2 and VO2. The VO2 session is going to make it so that it takes ages for you to come back into zone 2. True. If you're going to mix the two, probably say you've got an hour and a half session, maybe stretch it out to an hour and 45, do an hour of zone 2, followed by the 30 minutes of VO2 max work, and then you got like a 15-minute cool down. And just the fact that it's an hour and 45 minutes is an aerobic stimulus, and then the VO2 max, again, the maximal oxygen uptake stimulus, and then the fatigue. There's so much good that's coming from that session. If you do like exercise and you run or you ride and you do group rides or something like that, don't worry about it too much. Don't worry that your zone 2 is being interrupted. If you're going on a 4-hour cafe ride, and you're doing this purely socially, and you're not doing this to win the Tour de France, for example, then the aerobic stimulus going on there is above and beyond what 90% of the population are going to be doing, that you don't need to go, actually, I'm going to do a 2-hour zone 2 session on my own so that I'm only in zone 2 indoors, so that I stay at 200 watts plus or minus 5 watts for 2 hours. Just go do the 4-hour coffee ride or 2-hour coffee ride, whatever it is. Just go do it and enjoy it. Don't worry about the whole zone 2 malarkey. Just go enjoy yourself.
And you will also tend to remember